Now, if you've been here for a few weeks, you know that we have been going through the Gospel of Mark, passage by passage, and it's just been an awesome journey to look at Jesus through his eyes, through Mark's eyes, in depth, and kind of connect. You know, a lot of times we read Bible passages out of context, just because, like, it's the reading of the day. By the way, if you're following the reading of the day that we have a bookmark back in the back. If you're interested, you can grab one of those. We're reading a chapter a day of the Bible, and by doing that, we will get through the Bible in 3 years, okay? I know, it sounds like a long time, but we're already, I think, 100 chapters in, okay? So we're through the book of Genesis into Exodus. We've read some Psalms, some Proverbs. We're in Matthew. It's been awesome. So I just encourage you to connect with that. It's a very simple thing. It takes you less than 5 minutes a day to read one chapter. Now, if you want to be an overachiever, go ahead, right? Like, you can follow a plan that's through the Bible in a year. That would be awesome. But just as a church together, it's kind of nice to be on the same literal page of the Bible together, right? And I think God does something special there. So I just encourage you to grab one of those bookmarks back in our Connection Center. But as a church, we're in Mark chapter 8, 1 through 10 today. And if you have been here the last few weeks, you remember that I've recently spoken very highly of bacon, okay? And because bacon deserves being spoken highly of. But today, let's talk about bread. I mean, besides bacon, is there a more satisfying food than bread? I mean, even just the aroma of baking bread alone, without actually tasting or eating bread, is its own separate delight. Am I right? It's incredible. It's a unique and outstanding pleasure. There's something about the fluffy, spongy, soft, delicate textures and the gentle, smooth taste of bread that is a delight. And some of you are like eyeing those donuts that are left over there after I said that. Bread, of course, has so many variations because so many cultures around the world over millennia have made bread in different ways. It truly has been perhaps the widest used food staple in all of history. No matter what, if you have nothing else left in your house, believe me, this is a go-to for me, right? If you have nothing left in your house to eat, a couple pieces of bread, a little bit of peanut butter, and some honey will go a long way. You can almost call that a meal, right? It's like a sub-meal. And it is a staple in our home right now. Now, Jesus in this passage, he again serves bread to people. Let's read it together in verse 1 of chapter 8. In those days, when again, a great crowd had gathered, and they had nothing to eat, he called his disciples to him and said to them, I have compassion on the crowd, because they have been with me now 3 days and have nothing to eat. And if I send them away hungry to their homes, they will faint on the way. And some of them have come from far away. And his disciples answered him, How can one feed these people with bread here in this desolate place? And he asked them, How many loaves do you have? And they said, 7. And he directed the crowd to sit down on the ground. And he took the 7 loaves, and having given thanks, he broke them and gave them to his disciples to set before the people. And they set them before the crowd. And they had a few small fish, and having blessed them, he said that these also should be set before them. And they ate and were satisfied. And they took up the broken pieces left over, 7 baskets full. And there were about 4,000 people, and he sent them away. And immediately he got into the boat with his disciples and went to the district of Dalmanutha. Now, this is not the first feeding miracle that we've seen in Mark. In fact, just a couple passage, like almost 2 chapters before that, we see the feeding of the 5,000 in chapter 6. So you might be thinking like either Mark just really loves these miracles and he wants us to, get an inside look at these specific miracles, or we might be beckoned to think, what is different about this one than the other one? Like, why is Mark including a second feeding miracle if he's already had one? I mean, they're both amazing, but there's got to be a reason. I mean, this one's actually less as big as the first one. So why specifically is Mark doing this? What's different about this story? And there are actually a lot of different things about this story. There are some different details we notice. In the first story, there were 5 loaves. In this one, there are 7. In the first story, in this story, there are a few small fish, but in the 5,000, there were 2 fish specifically. In the first one, remember that there was this militaristic overtone, these Zionists, right? These zealots that were all about political Israel and wanted to kick Rome out. And so they saw Jesus as possibly like the Messiah to help them do it. And this region that he did the first miracle of the 5,000 was a region that was known for having a lot of zealots, or i.e. like Jewish terrorists, okay? And so they got this big crowd together and they're like, okay, this is your crowd. We're your army. Let's do this, Jesus. And Jesus is like, no, this is not why I've come. This is not what I've come for. So there's that element in the first one. There's not in this one. This crowd had been here 3 days, and it was a Gentile crowd. It wasn't a Jewish crowd. Remember we said last week that Jesus makes this shift in Mark? All of a sudden, he's been in Galilee, this area where the Jews were, and he had come as the Messiah to the Jews, the promised one that God had promised his people. And then he turns to all the Gentile nations, and he does things that a lot of people thought were very un-Messiah-like, like going to the unclean people. Remember, he declared all foods clean, and he said, you guys are so worried about the ceremonial uncleanliness, but you're not worried about the actual uncleanliness that comes from your heart. That's what really defiles you. And now to really shake things up, I'm going to go to what you consider the unclean, defiled people, the dogs, the Gentile dogs, and I'm going to go offer them the kingdom. And I'm going to start healing them, and I'm going to start casting out demons out of their territory as well. And so he makes this shift to the Gentiles, and he does this big circle through Gentile territory. Now he's in the Decapolis, and he does the same miracle that he did for the Jews of offering bread. Right? And we talked about what that means for a Jewish mind. The manna was God's care, covenant care of his people. Now he's offering this bread produced through him to Gentiles. So that's a big point being made here, and the reason why this miracle is included in Mark. But the main difference, I think that was probably, out of that, the main difference is the focus of the passage. If you remember, in the 5,000, it was from the perspective of the disciples. Remember, they were the one that brought up the need. They said, Jesus, there are 20,000 people here, because it was 5,000 men, not including women and children. So likely between 15,000, 20,000 people. And the disciples said, look at all these people. We don't have bread. You should send them away. And Jesus said, you feed them. So it comes from the disciples' perspective. But in this one, it comes from Jesus' perspective. He says he is looking at them. He has compassion on them. He brings it up. In the first one, the disciples' lack of faith and their desire to not serve in this specific way was more of the point of that passage. In this one, we have a focus in on Jesus' compassion. There are 2 whole verses just focused in on why Jesus wants to do this miracle. And that brings us to our first point. And that is that Jesus' sensitivity to our basic needs inspires trust in his provision. Jesus' sensitivity to our basic needs inspires trust of his provision. What does Jesus' compassion consist of? Now read again with me in verses 2 and 3. This is where we get his compassion. It says, I have compassion on the crowd, because they have been with me now 3 days and have nothing to eat. And if I send them away hungry to their homes, they will faint on the way, and some of them have come from far away. Jesus is literally feeling their hunger pain, right? He's feeling their pain. This word compassion is a Greek word, obviously. The Bible was written in Greek, or the New Testament was. And it is, say it with me. No, you don't have to. Splaggnizomai, okay? And it comes from the root splagnon, which means entrails or vital organs. So he's saying, I feel it in my gut, the pain that they are feeling. Like, I literally feel their hunger pains, but not just that, like what their hunger is producing for them. I feel it. I don't just see it. I don't just observe it as this sort of like outside observer. I feel it. And he says, I have compassion for these people. James R. Edwards, in his commentary on the Gospel according to Mark, he says that the phrase, I have compassion for these people, expresses Jesus' gut-wrenching emotion on behalf of the crowd. Equally important, in Mark, this word is not used of people for whom one would naturally feel compassion, such as friends or compatriots, but for those far removed and even offensive, like lepers in Mark 1:41, or revolutionaries in Mark 6:34, or Gentiles in Mark 8:2, and demon-possessed in Mark 9:22. So Jesus feels the pain of these people that normally people wouldn't think a whole lot about. And this is felt compassion. Now why? How could Jesus possibly feel their compassion? Because, he's God. And yet he's also what? Was Jesus ever truly hungry? All the time. Every day. Did Jesus have to make long journeys on a short amount of food? All the time. It's like all he did in his ministry, right? He walked from one place to the next. He made lots of long journeys. Had he had to depend on others for food? Right? Jesus would go and enter somebody's house and they would cook him food. Had he ever been weak? Like physically weak? Well, we know that when he was tempted in the desert by Satan, like he went on a fast for 40 days. And he was so weak afterwards that he could not even basically lift his hand up to his mouth. He had to be attended to by the angels or messengers of God in order to get better because he was so weak. So Jesus knows what it's like to be hungry. He has compassion, a felt compassion for people and their basic needs. But also Jesus is imagining their circumstances. Look in this passage. He's able to use his imagination to empathize with them. What does he say? He says, they've been with me 3 days and they have nothing to eat. So that means that they're very hungry, right? They've been here 3 days, they haven't eaten anything. And then he's also thinking about what kind of suffering this might cause them in the future. He's using his imagination to think about, like, what sort of consequence will this have in their life? And he says, if I send them away hungry to their homes, they might faint on the way, they might suffer. He doesn't say they're going to die, but, it's not fun to faint out of hunger. It's the worst. So he's identifying himself with them, and even in their future circumstances before it's happened. And then he also realizes what they've done to put them in this situation. He says that they have come from far away just to see me. Like, I'm realizing their needs, and I'm realizing their unique set of circumstances that have brought them to this basic need. And I am feeling compassion. Because if I were in their position, I would feel very hungry and would definitely be welcoming a meal if I was offered one. They've been with him for 3 days. And notice that he doesn't fault them. He doesn't even bring anything into that. In fact, he doesn't start like atomizing, which he doesn't start like pointing to minutia in the crowd, which he could, but he doesn't. He doesn't start thinking like, well, they were kind of unprepared. How often do you go to, a big conference without bringing your lunch? It's your fault, right? Like, why didn't you just bring? You can pack a picnic, but he doesn't say that. Why were they without food? Well, maybe they just left so quickly that they didn't have time to prepare. They heard Jesus was in the Decapolis, which he hadn't been there but one other time, and apparently news of him has gone all over. And so they hear it, and they're like, we got to go to Jesus. Everybody grab the kids, let's go. And so then they go, but we forgot our food. Well, it doesn't matter, Jesus. Let's just go see Jesus. So he doesn't point to that. We're also reading this with 21st century American eyes, where I don't remember a time in my life ever when our household was not with food. We were without food. Never. I mean, I have purposefully gone without food for a very short period of time, right? But never have I been forced to go without food. Never have I been truly living hand to mouth, ever. And this is a different time where people didn't have a lot of extra food, so maybe they just didn't have it to bring. And they were like working the day's wage, and they got their bread that night, kind of thing. And so they just don't have it. And if they're not working, they're not eating. He realizes their context. And nobody's asking, well, what if somebody freeloads? What if somebody hasn't been here all 3 days? What if somebody sees that like you're handing out bread and they just kind of like jump in the crowd to get a free meal? And he doesn't care. He doesn't mention any other circumstances. The only circumstances he mentions are the clear needs that he sees. And you know what? In this way, Jesus does not complicate his compassion. He can see the need, and he meets it. And what would a meal have done to people's trust of Jesus' message? I mean, it's just a meal, right? But it would have legitimized his message. It would have been a very palpable, physical way of showing his love towards the Gentiles in providing them food. It would have communicated care and love. You know, some of you people, you love with food. And you know what? I receive your love, okay? Any love you want to show me, I'm like down for it. Because that's how people, have you ever had somebody in your life like that? Like an aunt or a mom or somebody, right? Or even a dad or a grandfather, whatever. They just like, you've got to have food. Food is my love. Eat it and love me. And I love you, right? And I know that can get a little weird, but the point is that we also love by offering somebody food, right? And more than that, by preparing food for them, setting a table for them. It is a very palpable way of expressing love. It would have dispelled doubts. A lot of people are like, oh yeah, another Messiah figure. Great, we've seen these guys come in, they've paraded in, they've paraded out, and they've faded away. And ultimately, like, you know, it was all about them. It was about their agenda. It was about so that they could get a crowd and everybody could see how awesome they are. And Jesus is like, no, I want to feed you. I want to care for you. And then they get this meal and they're like, oh, maybe this guy's legit. It would have helped them follow him. Notice that his whole point was, I'm sending them away. I don't want to send them away hungry. Because if they're going to walk and all the things that they've learned the last few days that I've taught them, they need to be physically capable of doing that. I'm going to send them away full. They would have known that the things that Jesus gives are good. Just simple things that Jesus gives are good. They're always good. And they would have felt his compassion in a very practical way. I don't know about you, but I have been, while I said I've never lacked any food, there have been moments where finances were super tight. And that moment was when I was a young married, and most of us, like, that's kind of our financial tightness is generally, around that time. And my wife and I had just gotten married, and we came up to the States. We got married in Argentina, and we were traveling from church to church all over the country in this like old school green Ford Escort hatchback, right? That the brakes were questionable, and we were just, we were literally driving around the country by the grace of God, right? And we're going from church to church, and we had a very small amount of money coming in monthly. But as you can imagine, driving, like, we got offerings and stuff, but it was always like, well, you're not really sure. Like, I can see that we're going to be good for another month. Well, there came a moment when we had gotten all the way down to Georgia, and we were visiting some friends from college there. And I had talked about my ministry, but I hadn't really, sought for them to support our ministry. Or no, I think I had, actually, because that was everybody at that time, right? So we're there, and honestly, I was like, we've got enough money to get us to the next stop, but we have no more money. We're going to have to wait like a week at the next stop, and I really don't know what we're going to do. And it was scary. And we prayed, like, God, you need to provide. I don't know how you're going to do it. And, we were just like, and then you go through all sorts of questions, like, why am I doing this? Right? Like, I'm a missionary. I'm doing this for you, God, and like, where's the provision, right? And so we had breakfast, and we're leaving, and as we're on our way to our car, my friend Josh comes up to me, and he's like, hey, this never happens to me. This is really weird, but the Holy Spirit told me to give you $250. And I said, well, you better obey the Holy Spirit, right? I don't want to get in the way of you and the Holy Spirit. So I happily received the $250 that ultimately was from God through my friend Josh, right? He provided. And then the coolest thing about it is, $250 got us down the road, right? But it wasn't amazing. We were still pinching pennies, and I knew okay, that'll get us to the next paycheck and then to the next stop. But the coolest story is that we actually went around we went all the way down to Florida visiting churches on our way, and on the tip of Florida came through the Gulf side, and we didn't have enough money for a hotel. So I brought camping stuff for this specific reason, right? And so let's go find a camp spot. So we did, and Maria, my wife, was like, you should talk to this guy. He's like a park ranger. And so I said, hey, is there any good places to go camping? He's like, oh, you need to go to Fort DeSoto Beach. Okay, so we go to Fort DeSoto Beach. It was dark by the time we get there. We set up our tent. We have no idea, but we're like, all right, God's providing. We're able to have this space. We wake up the next morning, open our tent door, and we're literally on the beach. There are palm trees. It was the most beautiful scene in the world. And if we had gone to a hotel, we wouldn't have had that experience. Just the fact that God provides in all sorts of ways. He provides food for us. He's attentive to not just our physical needs, but our emotional needs. He knew what we needed, and He gave it to us. And this attentiveness, this sensitivity to our needs, inspires our trust. Because when things got tight again, I remembered the time that Jesus remembered that I was hungry. He felt my need, and He responded in a really specific way. And that's the second point, is that Jesus' practical love motivates our care of others. Again, notice that the disciples are doubting, which is sort of like a knee-jerk reaction for them once in a while, right? He says, they say to Him, after having already seen the 5,000 one, just a few months ago, who knows, they say, how can one feed these people bread here in this desolate place? And you're like, you don't remember Jesus did that already? They were like, you could do this, you did this before, can you do it again? They're not creative, they don't think of they're like, no ideas. All they can see is, there's no way. How can we do bread in this desolate place? We can't. And they don't ask Him if He would consider repeating. Why do you think that is? Do you think that, I kind of think that this might be the reason, that they think that Jesus wouldn't, He's healed, a couple people here and there, but He wouldn't do such a great miracle like that for the Gentiles. Those kinds of miracles are only really reserved for the Jews. So they're thinking again in practical ways, like we have no way to get bread for all these people. And so I think that's a possibility. Sometimes we also think that the disciples are on the same page as Jesus throughout His ministry. We think that they're completely they're on board, they get it. And some of what they do makes sense of that, like that they left everything behind and they went with Him. But then at the same time, you see all of these fits and starts where they're just they just don't get it, right? And I don't think that they're completely, even when Jesus, the reason why we know this is that when they come to arrest Jesus and take Him to the cross, where do the disciples go? Everywhere but near Jesus. They flee. They leave. And so they weren't obviously super solid yet. And even less so at this point in His ministry. So maybe they were succumbing to the Pharisees' critiques of Jesus. Jesus is receiving a lot of critiques, a lot of opposition. And maybe they're starting to maybe they have a good point. And so they just don't quite get it yet. They're not quite all in. Well, it happens to all of us. It's easy to critique the disciples from our point of view. But we also have mountaintop experiences, and then we quickly forget the power that we saw on the mountain when we were in the shadows of the valley. We quickly forget God's ability to do amazing things, to provide. And so Jesus demonstrates to His disciples what practical love looks like. And it's very simple. He has compassion. He feels their need. He looks at it. He's sensitive to it. He responds in very tangible ways. and he involves his disciples in fulfilling that need. And you know what? After the whole thing was over, there were leftovers. He's teaching his disciples to have an abundance mentality with themselves and with whatever they have. Jesus was about the kingdom of God and the souls of men and women turning from idols and sin and turning to him as their Savior and King. But he was also about serving people in very tangible, sometimes very basic and obvious ways. That's what Jesus was about. And Jesus' practical love was a response to people who sought him in faith. Notice that the people that get the bread were the ones who were there seeking him. He didn't give it to all of the villagers that were like, here, send some of this to... No, it was those who have come to seek him. But also, Jesus' practical love was oftentimes a motivator for people to seek him. It was a way of saying, listen, I take care of you. Good things come from me. It's a taste of who he is, as a way of beckoning them into a deeper relationship with him. Inspiring that trust, like we said in the first thing. But also, now he gives his disciples this model. When ministering to people, be practical. Be practical. Sometimes the best ministry you can give someone is a gas card. I mean, give them the gospel, but also give them a gas card. And maybe the other way around, like gas card first, then the gospel. Or maybe, like, give them a meal. Maybe invite them over into your home to give them a meal. Not just take it to them. Maybe give them a celebration. Maybe there are people in their lives who don't celebrate them. And a very practical, emotional need is to feel like you're noticed and that you're celebrated. Maybe, give them a conversation. You know, I remember this homeless man, and a few years ago, and I wanted to give him some food, so I gave him some food. But then I was like, I'm just going to sit down and talk to this guy. And we had, literally an hour and a half conversation. I didn't know what I was getting into, right? But he told me about his life. He told me about his struggle. I was able to talk to him about Jesus. And he knew about Jesus, but he didn't feel like he was clean enough to come to Jesus. And I said, you don't need to do that. You can come as you are, as broken as you are, as addicted as you are. I was able to sit down and talk to him. And you know what? What's really crazy about that is that I actually walked away also encouraged by this conversation. Sometimes we think giving is just one way. But when we give, even to very needy people, we also receive from those interactions. So when ministering to people, be practical. And you know what a very easy way to think about this? Think about the things you need. If you, like him, right? He's thinking, well, they're 3 days they've been with me. If I were like that, I would be very hungry. They have no food. And they've got to walk a long way. So he's just entering their story, thinking what would it be like for me? And so he just think, what would I need? Well, I'll provide that. The last point is that what Jesus provides satisfies completely. What Jesus provides satisfies completely. In verse 8, I love this detail. They ate and were satisfied. Satisfied, in a very simple way, just means full. I ate until I didn't feel like I needed to eat anymore. This was an all-you-need-to-eat bar. Okay? I don't like that phrase, all you can eat, like it's a competition, right? Or how much can you possibly fit into your body, physiologically speaking? That just sounds gross. But this isn't, you eat until you're full. Jesus isn't everybody gets the same rations, right? And kids get half a ration. No, he's just each one of you have your own physical needs. Eat until you're full. There's enough. It won't go out. In fact, there are 7 baskets left over. And the word for basket here is also different than the first one. The first one that we heard about, there were 12 baskets left over, and we're talking about a little personal basket that the disciples had to carry their stuff in the journey. So they had enough food for themselves afterwards, right? For another helping, for the road or whatever. But this is a different word for basket, and these baskets could be as big enough to fit people in them. They were enormous. And so they have 7 baskets full. So there's always going to be enough. Jesus' provision satisfies. It fills us up. But satisfaction also means contentedness. Right? Notice in my story that we got the money that we needed, and then we camped at the beach that we needed, right? Unknowingly. So it doesn't just mean it fills me up, but it also means that it satisfies me. It makes me content. Hunger is a natural desire that causes us to feel, and you fill in the blank because we all are a little different when we get hungry, but it causes me to feel unsettled. When I'm hungry, I stop focusing on what I'm doing, and I'm like, well, I've got to find food soon, right? I'm unsettled. I can't stay in this state of being hungry. We've got to do something about this, right? I feel anxious sometimes if I get really hungry. And yes, even desperate and angry if it's not satisfied. And I don't need to tell on my family, my poor family, right? Being in family of a pastor, sometimes I ask them if I can use these examples, and sometimes I forget. But Kiara is prone to getting hangry. She will melt down. And there's nothing to be done until we find a granola bar, right? You cannot reason, nothing. There's nothing. No threats of discipline, absolutely nothing will work except a little bit of food. It's the only thing that will help her get, and then when she gets food, it's like magic. She turns back into sweet Kiara. But when she doesn't have food, she's like this, it's like another personality, right? And that's what hunger can do. It creates that sort of feeling in us. But when we eat a good meal, our desire is quenched, and we are satisfied. We feel settled. We feel fulfilled. We feel, dare I say, safe. Right? Think about Thanksgiving. You eat a meal, and then all is right with the world. Because it's a beautiful, wonderful, tasty, fulfilling, satisfactory meal. And you feel happy. Food makes us happy. Eating doesn't just nourish us, but it delights us. And Jesus giving of food prepares them also for their life. And as our scripture reading taught us this morning, Jesus in John 6:32-35 says that he is the bread of life. He is our spiritual food. Our soul, like our body, has a ravenous desire for meaning, a need for satisfaction, an insatiable urge for purpose and fulfillment. Our soul gets hungry like our bodies get hungry. And we seek to satisfy our desire looking to be satisfied by consuming different created things. If I'm hungry for these things, then I'll find it in the created order, and things that are created, like food. Food can be something that people try to fill themselves, right? We all do. Or we get stressed and we eat. That calms us down. I'm going to treat myself to a little treat, right? And I feel better now for a moment. Right? And then let's take that even further, right? Like substances, the classics, right? Drugs and alcohol can give us this feeling of peace and satisfaction, and it numbs the pain for a moment. It fills that desire, but only for a moment. It doesn't last. In fact, afterwards, the desire is even worse. It's bigger. It's stronger. And it's still unsatisfied. And so that's what addiction, I just need to get more and more and more and more often. And eventually I'll fill it, but it never gets filled. No, there are a lot of good things that we can try to also fill this desire. Good created things like our relationships. They're good things, but then all of a sudden, we talked about this at our marriage refresher, right? All of a sudden we look to somebody to fulfill us in ways that they can't possibly fulfill us. They're not able to. So we put this burden on them. My fulfillment, my happiness, my satisfaction is now on you. So what you got? And then it doesn't take that long till it doesn't satisfy, right? They're not able to. Partially because they're sinners, but also because they weren't created to satisfy those desires in you. There are all sorts of things. Politics, sports, sex, success, family, fun and experiences. That's kind of like a new, well, it's not new, but whereas like maybe the boomers were like, I will feel satisfied in accomplishing and making lots of money and doing great things, right? Accomplishment. Now the younger generations are, I will feel satisfied in experiences. Those will fill me up. If I can only travel and see the world and experience things, then all of a sudden I will be fulfilled. Or status. But the problem is the hole is too big and the vacuum too strong, so that no matter what quantity or variation one consumes of these things, we are only left feeling more empty and less satisfied. And you know, some of us are on some funky spiritual diets, right? Like everybody's got a different diet these days, right? Some of them, like, you just never heard of these. And I think some of us are on a spiritual junk food diet. Right? We're consuming all sorts of things that aren't good for us, but they're kind of tasty, you know? They've got that, like, little powdered cheese stuff all over it. Gotta love that. Spiritually speaking, and that they never fulfill and they make us feel worse afterwards. But I'm going to say something, and this is just a terrible joke, but spiritually speaking, the no-carb diet is actually the worst for you. Because you need the bread of life. I told you, it was really cheesy. I debated about putting it in there, but I went for it anyway. So no, like, Jesus is the only thing that can satisfy. That's what he's saying. Have you probably heard Blaise Pascal, the Christian mathematician of the 17th century, said that there is a God-shaped vacuum in the heart of every person, which cannot be filled by any created thing, but only by God, the Creator, made known through Jesus Christ. So then that means if Jesus is the bread of life, then Jesus' life nourishes our life. That Jesus' life sustains our life. That Jesus satisfies our deepest desires in life like bread satisfies our hunger. He settles us. He fulfills us. We're not left wanting more or feeling desperate, but we feel safe, provided for, cared for, and Jesus makes us happy. I'm going to invite the band to come up as we close. And I just have a series of questions for us this morning. Are you, going back to the very practical aspect of this, are you currently afraid of where your basic needs are going to come from? We can get in those places. Have you lost your job? Or are you in danger of losing your job? There's a lot of cutbacks happening. Or maybe you feel smothered by crushing debt, higher prices for everything, and shrinking salaries. Anybody feel that when you go to buy eggs these days, right? So, pray to the bread of life that he might give you your daily bread. Because he's concerned about your practical needs, not just your soul. He doesn't divide those things necessarily. So you should work, you should plan, you should be wise in your finances, but you should also not worry about what you will eat or drink or what you will wear, but trust the Lord that sees your practical needs and is sensitive to your situation and will provide for your needs. Second, Jesus has cared for you and is caring for you, and he has given you people that come across your path or ones that come into our church or in our community that we get to serve practically like he does. It's an opportunity. It's truly better to give than to receive. Don't complicate your compassion. Give abundantly and freely what you have been given so that others might taste the practical love of Jesus. And lastly, we may have some souls in this place right here, some people who have yet to come and be satisfied by the bread of life. You have tasted all that the world has to offer you, everything. And you have filled your life with pleasures and pursuits, and yet your soul still aches with hunger. You might even be starting to wonder if you will ever find satisfaction, if you'll ever feel satisfied. I am here, and this congregation is here to tell you, to give testimony that Jesus is all-satisfying. completely. I mean, I know my own testimony, but I know a lot of testimonies in here. And I can tell you that they would raise a hand. Raise your hand if you say Jesus is all satisfying. And this is not just I'm raising my hand because I'm raising it. It's a story behind every hand. Jesus is all satisfying. You might, you can actually completely be devoid of everything else, and if you have the bread of life, you will be satisfied. So I want to invite you. We don't do this as a church, but there are other churches that do this. I want to invite you to come to the bread of life. And we celebrated the Lord's Supper, but in other churches they do this. They said, this is the body of Jesus, and it's broken for you. And just like the bread multiplied in Jesus' hands, his body multiplies and offers us forgiveness and satisfaction to all who will come and take it. And that's your invitation. If you don't know Jesus, come to him today. Take of this bread and be satisfied.